Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to this week's international webcast featuring our founder and president, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. There have been some quite extraordinary developments in the last couple of days. I think the most important to start with is the State of the Union address on January 30th by President Trump. Helga, what are your thoughts on what Trump had to say and the reactions to it?
Well, obviously, he did not say what he should have said, namely to go with the four laws of LaRouche, Glass-Steagall, and a credit system in the tradition of Alexander Hamilton. Now, we don't give up hope that that may still come, because after all, if you remember when my husband in 1983 had campaigned for what became the Strategic Defense Initiative. This was not mentioned by Reagan in the State of the Union address. But then on the 23rd of March, Reagan publicly announced the Strategic Defense Initiative. So, therefore we can absolutely hope that President Trump eventually, when he has to come to the question of financing the infrastructure, he announced that he will come back to his promise of the election campaign to implement Glass-Steagall. Otherwise, the speech was not bad. I think it's quite significant that according to CBS, in a poll, 75% of the people who saw the speech were in great support for Trump. So I think that domestically, he definitely touched on, a sense of optimism, even though there are still many problems, obviously, with the financial system, which he did not address. But I think, it's on a good course. I think the strongest indicator that he is doing something good is the freak out by the Democrats. And, while he appealed to a bipartisan cooperation on the immigrant issue, on infrastructure, the Democrats basically were sitting there demonstrating, non-applauding, and, in a certain sense, being quite the warrior party, the war party. I think that is become crystally clear, because in the context of the State of the Union address, actually one day before, was the deadline for the implementation of the sanctions, which the Congress had voted on half a year earlier. And nothing happened. The Trump administration did not implement sanctions against Russia. And there was a complete freak out by such media as the New York Times or think tanks like the Atlantic Council, who basically say, accuse Trump of completely going against what the Congress had mandated. But the simple answer of the Trump administration on the sanctions against Russia was that it was not necessary. Now, that's very good. I think that despite the fact that Trump, in terms of the foreign policy aspect of his State of the Union address, where he called Russia and China rivals, rather than partners, or something more positive, to which the Chinese reacted quite strongly. They said that this was alarming and provocative, but then a foreign ministry spokeswoman basically said that the United States and China should work together instead for a happier future of all of mankind. So their response was, on the one side, expressing displeasure, but on the other side, keep reaching out for the kind of cooperation which already was demonstrated between Xi Jinping and Trump. The Russians even responded, less harsh, because they in a commentary said that the speech by Trump was much milder than those of all of his predecessors, referring obviously to Obama and Bush. So I think that this is, not the end of the world. It's not what it should be. But I think, in the context of what is happening in the United States, one can also not expect, given the neocon mobilization, given the really ridiculous behavior of the Democrats, I think he did pretty well.
On the question of the Sanctions Act, there were articles saying that this just proves that Trump is a puppet of Putin. But on the other side, the whole idea of these kinds of sanctions is counterproductive, especially if Trump is trying to pursue a policy of cooperation. And that brings us to the whole question of the Mueller coup operation underway. There have been a lot of developments on that, including the probable release in the next couple of days of the Nunes memo. What do you make of the situation with this whole coup?
Oh, I think this is reaching very interesting dimensions. As a matter of fact, on the way out of Congress, Trump was asked if he would release this Nunes memo, and he said 100%. And then also the White House Chief of Staff, John Kelly, was interviewed, and he said that the White House would release this memo pretty quick because the American people should make up their mind on their own what their judgment is, and that is very good. So there again, you have a complete freak out. For example, the German media, which were absolutely not reporting about this whole controversy, or if they would only report about it from the standpoint of Russiagate, and soon Trump will be, gotten out of office. Now they have to cover their behind in reporting about it, but they're still on the line of the FBI leaning version, but they have to report it. So what happened this week was naturally dramatic. You had the decision of the House Intelligence Select Committee to release the memo. Then you had the firing of McCabe. That is very good. And then you have the ongoing operation by Senator Grassley and Senator Lindsey Graham, who on the one side are insisting on a criminal investigation against Christopher Steele, but they also sent letters to all leading Democrats, Podesta, the DNC, various other Democratic officials, asking them detailed questions. What did they know about the Steele dossier? When did they know about Hillary? Many, many questions. Then McCabe is also under a new investigation because, obviously it seems that he delayed the whole Hillary investigation concerning her emails by 3 weeks, trying to push it behind the November election. So I think that there is a lot of fury. You have people warning that the outcome of this will decide over the fate of the United States. For example, Paul Craig Roberts, who after all was in the Reagan administration, he had a very stern warning saying the stakes are extreme. If the coup plotters would get away with their actions, then the United States would turn into a full police state where the intelligence services would create a dictatorship, and no more accountability of the government would be there. So this is clearly the one side. And on the other side, naturally, there is expected hope that if this memo, which is due to come out latest tomorrow, because the rules are such that it has to be 5 days after the vote in the Congress, and that can really be an earthquake, because if what seems to be in this memo becomes public, I think it will change not only the situation in the United States, but it will have an earthquake effect internationally.
We have emphasized from the beginning the importance of going after the British role, especially as related to this Christopher Steele dossier and its promotion by Fusion GPS. And now it appears that there are people in the House and the Senate who are moving on this. But what more can be done? I mean, we're continuing to get out the Mueller dossier that we produced, but what more can be done to make sure that it doesn't get diverted or distracted, but it really hones in on this role of British intelligence as the key force behind the anti-Trump move?
Well, I think our viewers, that is you, we are really asking you to help to circulate this memorandum on the Mueller gate because it is a question of justice. I mean, there is also a personal question involved because this same Robert Mueller was the head of the Zepp-LaRouche task force in the 80s. He is part of the apparatus which was responsible that my husband went to jail innocently for 5 years, and many of our associates in the United States for even longer periods. And this was one of the biggest injustices. And, it has to be remedied because, I always said then, and I still keep repeating it now, the biggest crime was not only that my husband went innocently to jail, but that the American people were deprived of his ideas and his solutions. And I think that caused the suffering of the entire American people. If my husband would not have been prosecuted by such people like Robert Mueller, the United States would not, and he could have promoted his policies more successfully as a result. The United States probably would not be in the condition. You wouldn't have the kind of drug epidemics. You wouldn't have the kind of economic problems. So the crime was really committed against the American people. And then naturally, there is the aspect of Mueller's involvement in the cover-up of 9/11. And that is also something which absolutely has to be addressed and corrected. And naturally, the present operations against President Trump, I mean, this is also, has worldwide implications. This is the question of potentially World War III or not. So I think people should just help to get this dossier out widely and make sure that it remains on the front burner until justice has been implemented.
Well, and to go back to the question of the sanctions for a moment, we just saw in the completion of a new round of talks in Sochi on the Syrian dialogue, where the Russians have been taking the leadership, but there are other countries involved. And I'm not sure exactly how the US is involved, but clearly the attempt to push through new sanctions would undermine any US-Russian cooperation. President Putin, Foreign Minister Lavrov have repeatedly emphasized that they see a lot of the US-Russia problems stemming from the Obama administration. If we could get past this Mueller operation, what would be the potential for US-Russian cooperation?
Oh, I think that, President Trump has expressed repeatedly that it's better for the world if the relationship between the United States and Russia is a positive one. And I think that that is absolutely true, because then you could deepen the sporadic cooperation, which we saw in the case of Syria, and we also saw in the background of the Korea situation. And you could also then hopefully start to address the Ukraine problem, which is right now still a very dangerous one. So I think, there speaks 1 zillion reasons for such a cooperation. And, I think anybody who has a sense of world peace should understand that Trump, in that sense, is a donation from heaven if you compare it with Hillary Clinton and with Obama and with Bush before that. So I think, once you have this problem out of the way, where Trump feels boxed in, which he, clearly shows he's not boxed in totally, but, he's adjusting, like in the case of the vote that he didn't oppose the sanctions because he knew that his veto would be overridden. And Lavrov has made very clear that the Russians understand that constraint in the United States, which Trump finds himself in. So if these things would be removed, you could start addressing real problems like nuclear disarmament, serious efforts to reconstruct the Middle East, solving the Ukraine and the North Korean problem in a timely fashion. So I think all of these things are touched by that relationship between the United States and Russia in particular.
And Helga, what report did you get on the Sochi conference? It seems as though things did move forward on this. Is your sense that this is a positive development?
I think despite the fact that there was a sabotage attempt by some Saudi-sponsored groups who did not attend, but this was a huge conference with more than 1,500 delegates, and they established a commission to work on a new constitution for Syria. And I think it's very good because, they will now move on the idea, what's also in the UN resolution, that it is alone the will of the Syrian people how their government should look, what their government should look like, and what they want to implement politically. Now, this was all backed by de Mistura from the United Nations. And so I think it's both a big success of the Astana process, and it is not in contradiction to the Geneva process, but is an amplification of it. So I think overall the result is very excellent.
Now, I'd like to move to the economy because that was one of the things that, even though the president talked about it a lot, he did not fully go through with the policy that we've put forward. That, by the way, people can read it. There's now a pamphlet out on the LaRouche PAC campaign for 2018, what's needed for the United States. But we're seeing new signs of a financial explosion. Last week we had the Carillion company in Britain, United Kingdom, collapsing, 20, 30,000 jobs at stake. Now we have this report of a company called Capita, which may mean as many as 50,000 jobs lost. The stock market's wobbling. The Federal Reserve is talking about interest rates going up. Where do things stand on the financial situation?
Well, one of the potential triggers is exactly this corporate collapses, because, these are large firms. And, as many people have warned in the past, the corporate debt bubble is right now much, much bigger than in 2008, and it could be the trigger point. So this may be already the beginning. The behavior of the central banks in light of all of this is just completely irresponsible, to say the least. And the fact that now the EZB is considering to issue sovereign-backed bond securities, which is another expression of junk bonds, and that has been pointed out immediately by the deputy faction leader of the FDP, the Liberal Party in Germany, saying that this is exactly what triggered the 2008 crash. So I think that all the schemes to keep this system going, is not going to work. And the Federal Reserve announced that they plan to have at least 3 increases in the interest rate this year. And, this could very well be the trigger for the crash. We are exactly at this point, between a hyperinflationary blowout, which signs are mounting, among others, the stock market bubble, and also the potential of a collapse if you stop quantitative easing. So within this system, you are in a catch-22, and the only solution is to go back to what Franklin D. Roosevelt did in 1933, implement Glass-Steagall, finish the casino economy, and then go to a Hamiltonian banking system. Call it what you want. You can call it Reconstruction Finance Corporation. You can call it Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau. And once you would basically make the financial system sound again, there would be absolutely nothing in the way for the Western countries to fully cooperate with the AIIB, the Silk Road Fund, and other financial institutions which are backing the Belt and Road Initiative. And that is the only way how you can avoid complete disaster. And that is what people should really help to implement.
Well, as a sign of the bankruptcy of the economic reporting, Bloomberg interviewed, of all people, Alan Greenspan yesterday on whether or not there's a stock market bubble. Now, Greenspan is famous for his statement that there was not irrational exuberance before several different bubbles popped under his tenure at the Federal Reserve. So it's somewhat indicative of the problem that they still keep coming back to the people who caused the problem to discuss a solution. Bloomberg should be obviously interviewing your husband, who is the one who not only forecast these bubbles popping, but has a solution. You just mentioned the Belt and Road. There's some other very significant continuing developments with the expansion of the overall process of the Belt and Road Initiative. What do you have that you can tell us that's been going on in the last days and weeks?
Well, I think that the number of new projects on an almost daily basis, which get announced on a daily basis, is just breathtaking. Now, China is building a new deep seawater port in Nigeria. They are involved in many projects in Latin America. As a matter of fact, I think the new Silk Road spirit has caught on in Latin America now in the same way like before in Africa, where even countries which were previously more in the Washington consensus orbit, like Brazil, they are now very interested in Chinese investments in their infrastructure projects. Also Argentina, where the Chinese are with a large delegation. So I think that the advantages for countries to get the kind of credit they were denied before, I mean, that's just the winning dynamic. And there was a very interesting speech in Washington I was told about by a leading Indonesian economist and military person, who basically said that the American model of democracy, as it was pushed in the past, is just not convenient for developing countries who have many more benefits when they go along with the new Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative. And that is just everywhere. I think that this is the leading development. You have, even in Europe, you have more and more countries who are open. The Chinese, for example, are now building a fast train railroad between Oslo and Stockholm. This is very good, because once this becomes a pattern that the Chinese are building high-speed railroads in Europe, I think it will catch on. We had just in Germany this debacle where the first fast train connection between Berlin and Munich took 26 years to be built. Now, this was 550 kilometers, and the fast train system between Beijing and Shanghai, which is more than 1,300 kilometers, took only 4 years. So one of my colleagues in Germany made the funny calculation that if the Chinese want to have 45,000 kilometers fast train until 2030, and if Germany would build 45,000 kilometers and take the same speed they needed for the Berlin-Munich connection, this would take them 2,340 years and bring us into the year 4,500 to be completed. And this shows you what is really the difference, and how the new paradigm of the new Silk Road functions very concretely. It is just something which is absolutely doable, but it requires a certain intention to get the result, and then you get it. And where that intention is not there, it happens like in Germany, which is becoming, in that point, the laughing stock of the whole world. If you look at the Berlin airport, which will be probably never finished, it's a sad sign of what is going wrong in the Western countries.
Well, someone else who seems to have caught the new Silk Road spirit is Japanese Prime Minister Abe. He's been very much involved in interesting talks with Russia, China, even South Korea. Is Japan coming into the new Silk Road?
Yes, I would definitely say so. The Japanese foreign minister was just in China meeting with Wang Yi, and they had very extensive discussions to cooperate in third countries. And just today, the Chinese foreign ministry put out a statement saying that the new Chinese-Japanese cooperation has implications far beyond the two countries, and it opens the perspective of joint ventures in third countries. So I think this is very good. I mean, it's one sign that a major country like major industrialized country like Japan, who used to be completely in the Anglo-American orbit, going back historically quite some time, that they can recognize their interest. And Japan, is a country which is has not many resources and is totally dependent on large markets. And not naturally, the only available large expanding market is that caused by the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think this is very profound, because if Japan can, in that sense, find its own interest in the collaboration with China, well, so hopefully can the United States, and hopefully can also Germany, which has been a sort of a holdout, sticking to the old paradigm. And hopefully that can change by just looking at Japan as a model.
Last week, Helga, we covered extensively the mobilization by geopoliticians, neocons, and others to build up hysteria against China in the West. And that's continuing. Now, you're one of the leading experts in the West on China as it really is, as opposed to the nightmares of the neocons. What is it that Americans need to know about what's driving the situation in China?
Well, there is apparently a very interesting book, The Diary of a Girl, called Ma Yan. And she described how she grew up in the very poor northwest region of China, which is full of droughts and so forth, and how through very hard work, how she became, not wealthy, but, prosperous and good living standard. And I think this is a very good example, because there is all this propaganda about China and their intention and so forth. But what people do not want to look at and should look at is what are the values which govern the Chinese society. It is very much the idea of the common good. You have a central government which is, keeping absolute control, which is, absolutely correct. If you have a country of 1.4 billion people, you have to have stability, and the country is absolutely transformed. You have the fruits of the focus on the common good versus exaggerated individualistic hedonism, which is what characterizes the West. And the Chinese people are devoted to accomplish things. And for example, recently Chinese workers upgraded and changed a railroad station in 9 hours. I mean, what takes in Stuttgart 10 years or longer, they did in 9 hours. So, and that is because, they deploy 1,500 people to do it, and then they get results. They build railways by building the railway simultaneously at many points, and therefore they get ready easily. In the West, at least in Europe, you have also a terrible condition of the infrastructure, and then you have construction sites, and these construction sites last for years. You see maybe 2 workers for 5 days a week. And that's just not the Chinese approach. The Chinese say, we have to accomplish that, and we get it done. They do it with a large number of workforce, and then you see the result. And I think it is really important that people change their view on what is the intention of China. Because, look at the countries which are cooperating. Look at how their people become more optimistic, more happy. And I absolutely believe that China is absolutely truthful when they say that their aim is not to compete for hegemony of the world or have some new kind of global system. I think that the Chinese offer to have an alliance of perfectly sovereign countries working together for the common good and for the joint destiny of mankind is absolutely true. And we need a political discourse in the United States which is not tainted by geopolitical interpretations and wild fantasies where people only project their own intentions on in that case, on China or Russia for that matter. So I think we need a real discussion. What should be the future of mankind like? How can we have a foreign policy which respects the UN Charter, which respects sovereignty, which respects the other social system without trying to expose and export whatever you think your system is like. And I think then we can have a peaceful world. And yeah, I think that as long as Trump is in the White House and as long as this Mueller gate is being defeated, the chances that we will get there are actually very good.
And I think the final point on this, Helga, is that you said this is an unstoppable dynamic, except perhaps by thermonuclear war. The Chinese don't seem to be too much taken aback by the hysteria coming from the neocons. It's sort of part of what they expect, and they're still continuing to move ahead, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, the response was, let's join hands with the United States for a better future. So, they don't react to even provocations, which they recognize, but then they take the high ground and basically offer their model. So I think this is very good, and it is a reflection of the Confucian philosophy, which I think is underlying the paradigm of the Chinese.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Helga. I think that brings us to an end today, and we'll be back next week.
Yes, till next week.